Yeah, you know what? I'm going to take a strong anti-senior stance.
Okay. Coming to you from the West Coast, this is Politicoast, recording tonight on April 13th, 2017, episode 28. Politicoast is the podcast that explores what's happening in BC and across the country. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe and leave us a review on iTunes or wherever you found this podcast, and follow us on Facebook and Twitter where we're at PoliticoastPod.
I'm Scott.
And I'm Ian. This week, if you haven't seen it already, the Vancouver Courier's posted the first episode of the This is Lotus Land Politicoast crossover, where we speak with Barry just sort of about what we're doing and what our initial thoughts about the election are. Make sure to subscribe to their whole show because they're going to have some of our full interviews with David Eby from the BC NDP and Ryan Clayton from the BC Greens. And then there'll be a follow-up episode where we make some predictions that we'll probably recant later. But,
no, I intend on being right.
Well, being right's always the easiest way. Later in this episode, we will play part of the interview with Ryan Clayton, so stay tuned for that. But let's go into our first segment, 2 feet high and made of wood. Scott, what's a platform?
Well, it's apparently 2 feet high and made of wood, but in addition to that, it's basically the long list of promises the parties put out on what they're going to do should they form government, or more likely what they hope to do should they form government, but probably won't.
It's all the promises. What it used to be was a very detailed, policy-oriented thing, and it's sort of just become this platitude-filled talking point document that is that list of promises. A lot of party members really hope that everything they put into the policy documents and into the party's manuals translate into the platforms, and I think that used to be more the case, but it's really evolved into more of a strategist taking the best ideas or the things they think will win, let's say, picking those from the membership and wherever else they sort of come within the ideology of the political party and making a coherent narrative to sell for the election. We're talking about it, of course, because this week the Liberals and NDP both released their platforms. The Liberals, I think, on about Monday, and the NDP today. And we're going to go into them just so we can sort of get a sense. We talked a bit about some of the initial Green Party releases a couple weeks ago, and they've released their housing platform since then, and we'll come into that at the end of this segment, I think. But Scott, why don't you take us through the highlights of the BC Liberals?
Okay, well, the BC Liberals, their platform is very much about staying the course, highlighting everything they've done over the past 16 years, including taking credit for a few things they probably shouldn't, and really kind of selling we're the party to kind of keep a steady hand on the tiller. In terms of some of the highlights they're promising, they want to phase out PST for electricity for businesses, cap bridge tolls, cut the MSP premiums, reduce ferry fares, kind of a lot of little bits here and there to save you a bit of money.
Lots of tax credits.
Yes, there's some really small little boutique ones. Like one I noticed was the truck logger training credit, which is kind of adorably niche.
Well, when softwood lumber is coming up, you need to train people to drive trucks. The bigger question is going to be what happened when all of those jobs get automated, which is probably not that far in the future at this point, but I guess it's still good to get more people into the logging truck driving industry at this point.
Well, that is a lot, because they also tout tech quite a bit. It features heavily in their jobs portion of the platform, and a fair bit of that tech just focused on automation, including, automating truck driving jobs.
There's also, of course, things like car share tax credits and ride share legislation. A lot of the things in their platform they've already announced. This is, what political parties do these days. They trickle things out. So it's not really a big wealth of new promises, but
especially since a lot of this is building on the budget that they released last month. So some of the stuff, such as the MSP premium cuts, were included in that. Now we're just seeing them highlighted again.
But overall, it just doesn't give a lot of ambition or vision. It's kind of just, like you said, staying the course. They're running really hard on their record of, the last 16 years and saying BC's economy is, to their, honest credit, doing okay. We are making jobs when other provinces are struggling or going into austerity.
And they highlight the balanced budgets, the AAA credit rating, a lot of those sorts of things. But yeah, you're right. There isn't a huge amount of vision, though. Interestingly, it does appear to have more vision in it than they've actually shown in the last 4 years, particularly. For example, they talk about transit infrastructure, how they're putting all this money into it, but I think as anyone who's lived in Vancouver over the past couple of years, especially going through that transit referendum that disappointingly failed to pass, and they've shown a consistent tendency to pass the buck. There's been questions on whether or not the Broadway subway line was ever going to get provincial funding, and they finally announced it last week, but their actions kind of belie the yay, we're so pro-transit infrastructure spending.
It's very much the same story on education, where they're talking about all the money they're putting into education now, but they sort of leave out that that's Supreme Court of Canada mandated money, and they're just kind of meeting the obligations of the contracts they tore up 13 years ago.
And they're also actually talking a fair bit about how much they've controlled costs in education, too, so they're kind of playing both sides of that one.
So it's this sort of tight walk balance where they're making niche promises almost, I think, just trying to court very specific voters to build a coalition to cling to power for another 4 years, while at the same time trying not to rock the boat, I guess. You don't scare anyone away when you're winning.
Yeah, that's definitely true, although they do lean pretty heavily into the fear on this one, because reading through the platform, like every section has a text box with a big, this is how much the NDP and the Greens suck message in there. They attack them for everything from the Greens' lack of an agriculture export plan to pulling quotes from the 1993 NAFTA debates from the NDP.
To be fair, I think most of the BC Liberal voters will remember that, even if the BC Green voters were not born at that point. It's not surprising that they're sort of taking that tack. The Liberals play the risky NDP card every chance they can. It's always a little disappointing to see heavy attacks in a platform, or to even be the main focus of a platform, because this is supposed to be your vision document. Your what are you going to do, not what's wrong with the other people. Especially what's wrong with the other people when they haven't been in power for over a decade, and you have. The NDP platform does have a couple swipes at the Liberals, and in some of their preambles talk about, well, this is what they did, but here's what we'll do. And then they have a nice 2-page spread of just scandals, which you sort of have to do, I guess, at this point. But leaning on the attacks is something I think we're just going to see throughout the entire campaign. It's going to get dirty and messy. But speaking of messy, one thing that was sort of interesting to see, and I'll give credit to Lindsay Tedds from University of Victoria for noticing this, but when the platform was actually launched on the BC Liberal website, I guess it was 15 minutes late. They said they put it up at 11 and it went up at 11:15. I won't fault them for that. But they put it up on some weird program called FlipSnack that I'd never heard of, which I guess is a sort of like SlideShare document sharing site. But that's very bandwidth intensive. So it took a long time to download, even on a reasonable internet connection, which Lindsay points out sort of discriminates against a big chunk of this province that doesn't have good broadband, which luckily the Liberals are promising a bit of money for broadband. So, in another 10 or 15 years, they could download the platform and know what they could have been getting.
Yeah, about half an hour after it launched, I pulled it up on my lunch break, and I had the same problem where you turn the page and it was just a blank page, which, isn't the best look for a political party.
Even when I just looked at the platform itself, it's kind of ugly. Like, it's designed from 5-10 years ago. This doesn't necessarily mean anything about their competency as a political party, but it was just not pretty. It had these weird, fades from white to blue on every page, and we'll have links in the show notes so you can actually look at the platforms, at the actual policy, and I guess document design if that's your thing too. But the rollout issue is problematic, especially when they're talking about wanting to invest in tech, but they can't seem to understand how people actually want to use tech. And when the people who are digging into platforms on the day they launch are going to be the wonkiest of nerds, sort of like us and University of Victoria professors, you want to get those things right so that it just goes smoothly, and the only thing they can think about is, are your policies good or not are you even able to put a website together? Reminds me of the hacking allegations Christy Clark leveled against the NDP when it turned out they just posted something on their website wrong. It doesn't give me confidence in their ability to manage BC's tech industry when they can't manage a website.
Well, speaking of their tech platform, I was browsing through it, and more or less it's the sort of stuff you'd expect from a tech program or a tech platform. You know, a lot of little things, you know, increase, you know, number of university programs, that sort of thing, you know, little support for businesses and whatnot. But the one thing that really kind of struck me in there was actually similar to what we talked about with the BC NDP platform is they want to ensure that BC tech businesses are first in line for government contracts, which is a really weird thing coming a week after the rollout of the full text of the CFTA, which explicitly prohibits that sort of thing, which you kind of wonder why a government that negotiated that doesn't know they can't actually do that.
It's a pitch to voters. Voters want to hear that governments are making an effort to keep tech jobs here in BC. The thing is, they don't even really need to include that because the biggest tech firms in Canada are either here in Vancouver or maybe in Toronto. And so you can put that in there and not even actually have to do anything to probably still give it to a Vancouver company. You just say, oh look, I had 3 applications, 2 of them were from BC, and we just went with that one anyway.
Yeah, although with CETA also having the similar sorts of government contracting provisions, that's a little bit harder to do. But you do bring up a good point that there's a lot of stuff they throw in there that, it's not really the sort of thing a provincial government's going to do. And if I was setting the rules for what could be in a party platform, I'd limit it to things that level of government could do. And between this and the NDP one, the number of times they talk about things that are federal issues, gets a little annoying. And we'll get into it with the NDP, but they talk about, increasing penalties for drug dealers who dealing with dangerous additives in their stuff. And they don't have that power. The criminal code isn't a provincial matter, and it's just really annoying to actually see stuff they can't actually deliver on put so prominently in a platform.
I guess they could argue that they can direct the attorney generals to seek harsher penalties and seek harsher sentencing, but you're right, it's sort of the criminal code that sets what the sentencing sort of levels, minimums are, where there are mandatory minimums. I mean, one of the other big sort of pushes in this platform from the BC Liberals is to move towards sort of solving the constantly increasing ferry fees. And the way they suggest that's going to happen is by sort of continuing a decade-long consultation on ferry fees where people say ferries cost too much, and then BC Ferries doesn't do anything. But in the interim, until they manage to implement some kind of loyalty program, I guess, it takes a lot of time to roll out a stamp card, like my coffee shop has. They're going to introduce a tax credit for people traveling on the ferries. The details of this tax credit are still a bit vague, but in their platform they can't really make clear whether it's a credit or a deduction, and I'll give Lindsay Ted, again, a shout out for her analysis of this, and we'll link to that in the show notes. And so it's just hard to tell if this will benefit everyone who rides the ferries or just those who actually pay taxes and get the deduction. And so it's kind of a meaningless announcement. And even then, once again, it's sort of to me like the transit credit that the federal government just got rid of. Let's just put the money into reducing fares. Like, why take longer unless you're just not going to do it?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. The whole going with tax credits, it's popular because it often doesn't really show up in a budget as an expense because it's just a little less revenue, and you don't show massive increases in spending when you actually have what's effectively a large outlay from the government. But yeah, this along with their MSP premium tax credit is basically the same problem where you actually have to remember, you have to go through trouble filing it and claiming it on the tax return and everything. It's just not a great way to do it. It's a way to actually, seem like you're helping when you're putting a bureaucrat stepping stone in the way, and it makes it, a little harder to actually get that money. The uptake won't be as good.
And then on top of that, they're going to put a bit of money, $1 million, into improving BC Ferries Wi-Fi, which I guess is going to be helpful, but...
Well, and that you could actually get on the internet now with it? The Wi-Fi on the BC Ferry is so terrible. You'd be able to better communicate with smoke signals. One thing I will just say and give them credit for is in their housing section, which is disappointingly a little vague and short and full of bad ideas like the BC Home Partnership Program, they do at least acknowledge that they do need to increase the housing supply and the permitting process needs improvement. Now, granted, these are municipal issues, so that gets back to my previous thing, but at least in theory, the provincial government has powers over the municipalities and can kind of force their hand on it. So, it's at least one bright spot. And actually, to all three parties' credits, they at least all acknowledge there's housing supply problems, but it's a little disappointingly vague on it, even if they do finally have the right idea on where the problems are.
Well, and I guess to close off this sort of section on the BC Liberals, I'll mention that they also, alongside their platform, I noticed put out a Vancouver Island platform, like specifically targeted to the island, where the Liberals have the fewest seats. And I think that's just why. As far as I can tell, they just repackaged their main platform commitments that deal with, I guess, quote-unquote island issues. So again, ferries, waterways, capital region transit, and that sort of thing. But then just sort of hyper-targeted at the, you've been underserved by electing opposition MLAs for so long. Why not elect some government MLAs to sit in the backbench and just vote along with everything? But it gives an interesting angle at where the BC Liberals are looking to try to make gains if they wanted to build on their majority instead of sort of playing defense. But we'll see if they run the pitch on the sort of pumping up this Vancouver Island platform, or if they do spend most of the election playing defense and just sort of brushing off scandals. Well, let's switch gears into the BC NDP's platform. They similarly are rolling out a lot of the thing. They're similarly talking about a lot of things they've already rolled out. So they'll get rid of MSP, they'll have $10 a day childcare, they'll have $15 an hour minimum wage, they'll get rid of the tolls on the Port Mann and Golden Ears Bridge, which was mentioned a bit earlier this week.
In fact, that was announced while we were recording our previous episode, slamming the Liberals for their tolling policy.
Yeah, and I think we both agree that neither of these are the ideal. At least to me, the get rid of tolls entirely makes more like coherent sense. I still would rather see the congestion charges and expand tolls to the other bridge to make it fair if that's your problem. But at least it's not just like promoting commuting over casual driving.
Yeah, it doesn't have that imbalance that we talked about, but it still is incongruous with a lot of the other NDP kind of planks. Like, it's regressive, it's bad for the environment, it causes congestion, it reduces air quality.
I think the way
it just lowers quality of life in general. Other than kind of the knee-jerk anti-user fee position that the NDP seems to have, there isn't really a huge amount going for that as far as policy.
Well, I think that's how you have to put it in context with the rest of the NDP platform, because a lot of the things they're talking about, especially in their sort of making BC affordable, are cutting fees and cutting things that sort of hit individuals. So freezing hydro rates, rolling back ferry fees, eliminating the tolls, eliminating interest on student loans and giving a $1,000 grant for students who complete. They have this new annual rental home credit of $400, which the details are still sort of being fleshed out. And it's not clear whether it's a sort of universal.
I'd say it isn't universal because they don't cut user fees on the other main version of transportation, which is public transit. Like, it doesn't make a huge amount of sense to me to be so anti-against user fees but only when it comes to car infrastructure on the transportation issue, especially when doing so is even more regressive than the normal user fee argument, in that low-income people disproportionately use public transit anyway. Not only is there the general regressiveness of user fees, but now it's only applied to the most regressive part of that.
But those people are already voting NDP, so they don't need to sort of win those votes.
Yeah, and to put a little counter on that, I'm not sure new transit money's best spent on reducing fares versus building out the system, but at least it would be more consistent on the NDP's part. And it's kind of disappointed reading through the platform because they, to their credit, they identify the fact that the having tolls on two bridges is a little arbitrary and shifts people's usage to the Patello or the Alps Fraser. Now, where it's disappointing in there is that they draw the wrong lessons from that in that, okay, tolls shift people's behavior. So rather than using that behavior shift to, say, reduce congestion, they'd rather just scrap it entirely. But the natural corollary of tolls reduce use on that is that people will use it more, increase congestion, and then we're kind of back at square one. It's just kind of a little disappointing to see them take such a kind of pocketbook populist approach to this rather than seriously engaging with the congestion problem that's hurting the city and the region.
The other big chunk of the BC NDP platform is where I think we're going to see the BC Liberals go after them, and that's just all of the sort of spending items that they've thrown in there. They talk about building 114,000 rental and co-op homes. They talk about, in addition to the sort of grants and tax credits and cutting fees, they're going to put more money into classrooms and school equipment and make schools earthquake safe, replacing portables with classrooms, apprenticeship and job trainings programs, more doctors in community neighborhoods, reducing waiting times. Some of these are a bit more vague, but they all involve money. They talk about creating 96,000 construction jobs just by building shit, like build schools, hospitals, roads, rapid transit. So at least they are throwing some money into that. But all of this is going to cost money. And their sort of way to fund it looks like it's going to come from the carbon tax, which they don't talk about being revenue neutral as far as I can tell.
Oh, they explicitly walked that back. And, I mean, they're not quite as bad as the Alberta NDP. It's revenue neutral because we'll spend the money, which was just kind of stupid. But it's still, they're very much clear that they're going to be spending some of this money, and it's not all going to be rebated back, which I'd consider a negative, but you might differ.
They will be rebating some of it with
Yes.
their sort of climate rebate checks to 80% of homes, and that's what they announced a few months ago. But they are raising the carbon tax. And remember a couple elections ago, this is the BC NDP that said, axe the tax, and they went around the gas stations saying, Gordon Campbell's carbon tax is going to hurt you and your family. So at least they've come around on carbon taxes from there. The rest of their money is going to come from reinstating a high-income tax bracket that Christy Clark removed in the last few years. So they're not calling it a tax increase. They're sort of saying we're going to roll back a tax cut. Which,
it's a tax increase.
It's a tax. It's a tax on rich people, which will play fine with NDP base. And the other thing is raising the corporate tax by 1%, which, again, they can say is just sort of rolling back a cut. But, again, it's an increase.
Yeah, and especially when a lot of these cuts were also, in part, a response to the carbon tax. So if you're going to be rolling back those tax cuts, now the carbon tax is even less revenue neutral than before.
One place they will be actually cutting taxes is the sort of always popular small business tax cut, where they're going to lower the small business tax rate from 2.5% to 2%. One of my personal issues with this is people really like to think of small business as job creators, but they are actually kind of the worst job creators. Like, small businesses tend to be the companies that can't really afford a lot of employees. They can't always afford the proper labor protections. They tend to go contracts. That's not to say Walmart is the best employer, but sometimes having a lot of employees means you have a better sense of what the laws are. And so small businesses can actually be pretty bad for unions and for union households.
Canada actually has a problem with firm growth. We kind of have that missing middle of firms. We have a few big ones and a bunch of small ones, but we actually kind of don't have as many kind of mid-sized firms as you'd expect for kind of an economy our size and a country our size and state of development. And putting in more kind of tiers of the corporate tax rate isn't going to help. And already there's a lot of regulations that kick in at a certain firm size. So there's all of these things that kind of limit growth in that way and kind of hurt the move from that small business to that medium-sized business. And having different tax rates, I'm not sure is going to help on that problem either. Plus, the corporate tax just isn't that great a way to raise revenue. it's pretty distortionary, and you tend not to get a nice linear increase in revenue with an increase in the tax rate. For example, currently the BC government only gets about just shy of 2.8 billion of the roughly 50 billion tax revenue they take in each year from the corporate income tax. So it's just not a big moneymaker for the government, and a 1% increase just isn't the sort of thing you can fund all of these spending promises on.
But they did manage to say that they'll find $360 million from, quote, cleaning up BC Liberal waste and just growing the economy.
Yeah, it's a fudge factor in order to make the numbers balance out at the end. Because at that same year where they're expecting to get that $360 million from, they're only going to be running an $80 million surplus. But if you actually go through the NDP platform, there's only 9 references to waste in the entire thing, of which the only ones that are specific on is partisan ads and the legal battle with the BC teachers. And, one of them's over now, and the other is, a few million. It's not $360 million worth. And there just usually isn't that much waste in government. Like, there's a lot, but not the sort of thing you can easily just clean up and make better.
That's what sort of Rob Ford found out when he became mayor of Toronto. He ran on I'm going to stop the gravy train in the city of Toronto, clean up all this waste, and we'll have such a huge budget surplus after all of that. And then he got in and went, oh, Toronto's actually an okay run city. There's just not that much to cut. So he had to just go to slashing contracts and the usual right-wing things. But
I mean, it's a pretty common thing for politicians to run on is cut the waste. But I think anyone who's ever worked for a government can definitely say there's places that you could improve efficiency in spending. It's not hundreds of millions of dollars worth. And I guess the other side of it is the growing the economy part, which when you do the math and figure out that BC rate is roughly 21% of GDPs and is what the tax revenue works out to, it's basically a 0.7% increase in GDP, which that's a fair bit to just assume your platform's going to create. So yeah, it's a fudge factor, and it's basically there to make them be able to balance.
And, they put numbers in at the end to quote-unquote balance it, but their literal budget for sort of how this will all balance out is 4 lines where they go the projected surplus, new revenue and savings, new operating investments, and then they just sort of add those up. So it's basically how much money we have, how much we plan to spend. They don't even break that down, though. And then how much money we'll get, and they don't break that down either, and then just sort of add them up. So it may as well have been done on a napkin, I guess, but it's there. But I guess this comes back to how platforms have really shifted from those detailed, wonky documents to be more talking points and selling memos. They have the numbers in there just to be yeah, we have numbers, but no one really cares, Scott. They care about MSP cuts, and they care about big promises that may or may not be fulfilled.
Although that isn't always the case, in the 2015 federal election, the NDP got torn apart for their costed platform they put out, which was more or less could have been done on the back of a napkin. And it's always a bad sign when, during the press conference where you're unveiling it, the media that are there are just tearing it apart while you're going in there. And this one isn't much better. They haven't seemed to have got quite the level of pushback the federal NDP did.
I think it's because Tom Mulcair ran so heavily on we're going to balance it, when even the Conservatives people were a bit skeptical of them saying they'd balance it.
Yeah, we're going to ramp up all this new spending, not raise taxes, and balance the budget. It just wasn't going to happen.
And then once you had the Trudeau Liberals come in and say, yeah, we'll just run a deficit, so it doesn't really matter. And people went, oh, I guess those numbers make sense, because they can be whatever.
Well,
they did have a number, which they've just blown by, but that's a whole separate topic that we've touched on elsewhere.
But yeah, so this one actually has a little... I guess they can also get a little more play because they're throwing in both revenue and expenses on there, so it isn't quite as clearly bullshit on the face of it. So kind of the 2 big pieces of housing in there is the $400 tax credit, which on the one hand, it does kind of balance out against the BC Homeowners Grant, which is basically a tax giveaway to anyone who owns a home in BC. So on one hand, it's nice to balance it out. Now, I'd rather they just tax the other one rather than add in a different tax credit in there. And it does kind of go to the just throw money at the problem sort of thing. So it's just not the sort of thing that I can really see making much of a difference. Especially $400, that doesn't go very far. That's what, like last year's rent increases in Vancouver? And the other part I wish they'd gone to a little more detail is we talked about that 114,000 new homes over 10 years, but they don't really talk about how they're going to fund it, and that's a lot of money. If you assume it costs, say, $150,000 to build a unit, which isn't out of the question, that's decentish ballpark for a low-end unit in Vancouver. That's $27 billion, roughly. Like, that's a lot of money.
Over 10 years.
It's over 10 years.
2.7 a year.
Yeah.
Which is significant in a budget of...
Currently, the budget's roughly $50 billion. But that represents 5.5% of our current provincial budget when you break it down, assuming it's evenly spread out over those 10 years. Like, that's a lot of money just for housing. And they don't go into a huge amount of details how they're going to pay for it other than... So they've spent to raise a few $100 million through their kind of anti-speculation taxes. But that doesn't get you to the several billion dollars you need just to meet their affordable housing building targets. And not only that, it's just kind of targeting the affordable housing part, which doesn't do a lot of good when the entire market is out of whack. It's good for kind of the bottom people, but when your average person can't afford a house, kind of targeting affordable housing for a certain section doesn't kind of cover the overall problems of the housing market. And it's nice they identify that there's a shortage of affordable housing. It's kind of disappointing they don't identify the shortage of housing in general, and that the lack of housing being affordable is a function of overall lack of supply, not just lack of affordable supply.
Yes, they're hoping to fill in the bottom to free up the middle somehow. Although people don't tend to go down.
Yeah, that's the thing is... housing tends to filter down, not filter up. So kind of along the same vein as the tolling issue, something that struck me was the freeze on the BC hydro rates. In that, I think it kind of goes to the same sort of problem where it's penny wise and pound foolish and kind of goes against some of their other big planks. If you freeze the hydro rates, it's basically you're subsidizing people's energy consumption at that point, and that kind of goes against we're going to be energy efficient and we're going to use less energy, be good for the environment. And it's one of those things that seems to be throughout the BC NDP's platform is if it actually costs people, we won't pursue these other goals we have. And I think that's the problem, in that they're trying to basically ignore any of the price nudges that encourage people to use less electricity, to drive less, and all of these things. And they're kind of working against their own goals.
They're going to put the money into the sort of nanny state nudges, like the public awareness campaigns and the Louis the light bulb. Use less energy, while still making it affordable for you to use as much as you want. The one thing I'll say to their credit is most of BC's energy is pretty green. We have a lot of hydroelectricity. We have a lot of new green energies coming online. The amount of greenhouse gases released by BC electrical generation isn't as bad as, say, Alberta or Saskatchewan, where they rely still heavily on coal-fired power plants. So there's the argument that the environmentalist wing of the NDP doesn't want to see Site C Dam and other hydroelectric dams brought on because of the sort of environmental damage those do. And that's where they sort of run into the tension. And just in general, like you said, reducing energy use is a sort of thing they're trying to talk about, while also, like you're saying, being a bit duplicitous.
I also like the BC Liberals. Ferry fares are something they want to tackle. Want to freeze ferry fares and roll back some of the increases on routes, and also return to the seniors weekday discount. And I'm just really not sure that's a great use of money. It costs the same to transport a person regardless of their age, more or less. And not only that, if we're going to be going for the redistributive aspect that the NDP seem to like, the senior cohort is among the wealthiest in the country. And while there are seniors in poverty, it would make more sense to go for an income-targeted thing than a age-targeted approach.
That's just because you're not a senior yet. And once you hit 65, you're going to be reaping every single coupon you can get.
Maybe, but it's still bad public policy to discount seniors. If you're going to be worried about, the welfare of seniors, well, target it on the actual welfare side, not the age side.
It's definitely one of those sort of buy the votes of the people who are most likely to vote. And it's why seniors show up more frequently to vote than millennials. So they're going to get special throwouts from every political party. And no one wants to be seen as cruel to seniors, because everyone has grandparents or had grandparents, and they generally have warm feelings to them, unless they're, racist grandma. But even then, you're like, oh, she's quaint racist grandma, as opposed to someone who's your age and racist. That's just ugly. So there's that sort of age sympathy and that feigned respect. And so people want to see policies like this, even if they make no rational sense. And finally, their last big pitch is to sort of clean up BC politics. And so they've already talked a lot about, banning corporate and union donations and setting limits on individual contributions, ending the partisan advertising. But they do actually talk about electoral reform in here. It's in a sort of one step back, where they talk about making every vote count by moving to a proportional system, but putting it to a referendum. And this has sort of been where the NDP's been a long time. But what I noticed in there is they did have the sentence, and, we will campaign for the yes side, which is sort of the...
It's a little damning they even need to say that, because they have campaigned for the no side before.
Well, they've sort of sat out in the last elections with major NDP strategists campaigning hard for the no side, which just looks petty when you're like, well, you just clearly think the only way you can get power is if 39% of people vote for the NDP and 38%, or even sometimes slightly more, as happened once, vote for the BC Liberals, but the NDP gets in. So I'm happy that they'll run a referendum and go for the yes side. It's at least in there. I can't say the same about the Alberta NDP.
Yeah, but it is kind of a little disappointing that they really, I guess, lack credibility on the issue because of how they've done it in the past. And the NDP kind of has a MMP or nothing approach to a lot of the electoral reform stuff. And STV's a good system. Like, BC would have done well under it. So it was disappointing they didn't back it when it came up, because it wasn't the perfect system as far as they were concerned.
Or even when it came up again, because they went through that whole mess. But this is one of those promises that sort of got buried near the end of the platform, and that we haven't really heard John Horgan talk about yet. And we saw at the federal level when Justin Trudeau, even months before the election, I think like a full year, came out and said, we will end first past the post and we will bring in some electoral reform. And he kept mentioning it for a full year through the campaign. And it took all that sort of momentum to get him to the committees to study it, to still kill the promise. So it doesn't give me a lot of confidence that they sort of just buried it in there. I'm happy that they say they'll campaign for it, but I'll believe it when I see it, I guess.
Finally, on this week, the Green Party released another part of their platform. Unlike the NDP and the Liberals, they've kind of been trickling it out. We've talked about their agriculture, their tech, their climate platforms already in a previous episode. But this past week, they released their housing platform. And in the interview with Ryan Clayton that you'll be hearing a little later, he hinted at it, but it was recorded before the release. But we finally have it now, and it's an interesting mix of items in there. On one hand, they're going pretty heavy on the taxes on that. They want to make the property transfer tax more progressive, so basically have it on a sliding scale. They want to put a lifetime cap on the capital gains exemption for primary residences at $750,000, which on one hand is going to be pretty rare to hit that amount, because that's the gains on the house. So that's a big increase right there. On the other hand, I'm not really sure capping that makes a huge amount of sense, because you do generally want the primary residences to be not hit with too hard of taxes on that sort of thing. And perhaps most strikingly, they want to increase the foreign buyers tax from 15% to 30%.
Well, and they also want to introduce a progressive property tax system to basically impose a surtax based on the property value and then give you credit for rental income based on your previous year's income tax. So I guess they'll basically look at how expensive is your home and have a more sliding scale of property taxes versus the, I guess, sort of flat tax model that's generally imposed by municipalities right now. What's not clear to me in that proposal is where that money essentially will be going, because right now your property taxes go to fund your municipality and to fund your local services. So either they're going to force this on municipalities or they're just going to collect it into the provincial coffers.
Well, I'm not sure the municipalities would complain about a bunch of new tax revenue that the provincial government gets blamed for. Yeah, one of the other things in there is they're looking to change the home ownership grant, which we complained about in the BC NDP section on this, to a more progressive model, which is basically income tied, which I want to see them get rid of it overall, but this is at least an improvement over the current system.
Right, so this gives them theoretically lots of new money in the bank to play around with, and they definitely play around with it. They're pitching spending up to $750 million a year to build 4,000 new units a year. The NDP, for comparison, was building about 10,000 per year. Not that it's a competition. I mean, it is. This is where they've sort of budgeted it, and this gives you a sense of, like you were talking about, the amount that it costs to build a home. The NDP didn't really cost that in the same way.
Yeah, unlike the BC NDP, they are focusing a little more on just the overall market and not just targeting the low-income household, which is good because, as we were saying, it costs a lot of money to build housing, and you run into some viability difficulties when you start running it all through the government. Like, crowds out a lot of other funding, which, isn't great, especially when, Bay Street has a lot of money kicking around that they'd be happy to invest in housing if there was the situation where you could actually build housing fairly quickly and without going through years of planning headaches and permitting issues and zoning problems. And to the BC Greens' credit, they've actually identified zoning as one of the things they're going to look at. So they want to lead a comprehensive rethink of zoning and encourage objectives such as densification, especially on transit corridors. Good on that for identifying. They're the only ones that actually picked out zoning as one of the main problems towards affordability.
Zoning being a municipal issue that you also criticize the BC Liberals and NDP for wading too much into.
Yes, although if you do recall, I did say that in those segments as well, that unlike them wading into federal issues, the BC government actually, in theory, has power over it. In fact, explicitly does, because all the municipal powers are provincial powers delegated to the municipalities. And, well, normally, I'm not a huge fan of those sorts of things. The fact is the city governments have pretty consistently failed to act on these issues, so maybe a little stronger nudge from up above wouldn't be the worst idea.
And the Greens are just looking at, quote, lead a comprehensive rethink, so they sort of want to start the discussion. That's why this section's a bit vague, but they, like you say, want to talk about revitalizing neighborhoods, densities, sort of looking at communities, which gets a bit into the green, woolly, let's all have nice neighborhoods. But nice neighborhoods are nice. And so credit to them for that section.
Yeah, and not only that, nice neighborhoods don't have to be the enemy of density, and a lot of those cases actually feed off each other. If you don't have zoning and minimum parking requirements, which I disappointingly aren't in here, but are a big problem towards both affordability and walkability and low vehicle usage. If you tackle those issues, you tend to just naturally get fairly dense walkable communities, because that's generally what's profitable to build in a city like Vancouver, absent all those kind of regulatory nudges towards lower density, lots of expensive parking spaces that people might not use if the city was actually more built around other methods of transportation.
Yeah, I'll give full credit to the Greens here. They have a fairly comprehensive housing platform that looks like they've given a lot of thought to what all the issues are, and at least what needs conversation started on. They don't necessarily provide solutions to everything, but they talk about changing things or enhancing the Residential Tenancy Act to make sure people don't get rent-evicted, as it were, or finding other ways to sort of fix part of the problem in social housing. Like this is where their other big spending is here, to put $100 million into retrofits and renovations for older social housing. And they sort of justify this as long-term savings, because right now we have a lot of social housing that's falling apart, I guess. And if you fix it, you save maintenance costs. Maybe you don't save $100 million, but you put poor people in nicer homes, which just seems like the morally correct thing to do.
Yeah, overall, I'd say the Greens, I guess, have the most balanced platform of the three parties on the housing issue, where they're looking at both kind of the revenue and tax changes and the supply issues in a much more comprehensive way than either of the other two parties have.
So we have a few more planks, I guess, of the Greens to come out, but going forward, the question's really going to be how the different parties play these playbooks, I guess, how they sort of pitch the stronger and weaker parts and which attacks they go after on each other. The Liberals sort of have the least meat in there. They have just a general stay the course kind of, and a few tokens to, a few specific constituencies. The NDP have a tax and spend platform, which will appeal to their base, but will also have a lot of points of attack for the Liberals.
Yeah, and at least with the Liberals, their spending and their taxes are costed out better.
And the Greens, we've still yet to see the final costing, but they're, trickling in their ideas. And I think we had more criticism for the agricultural policy that happened to be much more on the just buy local everything and farmers are great, without maybe the longer term and sort of deeper thought on it that we see in the housing platform. So there's strengths and weaknesses to all of them.
Yeah, and I'll be looking forward to seeing what their transportation platform is, and I'm hoping they avoid the pitfalls that the other two parties have gone for around tolling.
But there aren't a lot of strategists sitting in the back rooms of these political parties going, yeah, let's try and run on raising tolls for everyone.
Yeah, it's not politically popular, even if it's the right thing to do. And when you look at the places that have successfully implemented it, like Stockholm, they introduced it first as a pilot project in the middle of a term, and it turned out to be pretty popular, so they kept it. But it was pretty unpopular when they first announced it. So that might be the better way to politically align things with the better policy.
Well, and sometimes people spend a lot of time focusing on the platforms, and what we sort of saw what we should have seen in the US is people actually look at the politician and do you trust that person to sort of implement the policies, because situations will change. We could be in an entirely different fiscal situation in 2 years, and none of the parties could do anything they talk about, and who do you trust becomes a bigger issue.
As Kim Campbell famously said, elections are no time to talk about serious issues. Okay, well, moving on to segment 2, Liberals reach new highs. The Liberal government finally unveiled their proposed marijuana legislation today. I guess it was a little too cliche to do it a week from now on 420. But under their new legislation, people will be allowed to possess up to 30 grams of marijuana, and the provinces will be allowed to set rules around distribution. If they want, they can put it in the same locations as alcohol. It's really up to them. So I'm sure in Ontario it will be the LMCBO or something.
LCCBO, liquor cannabis.
They've also put some limits on how it can be advertised. It can't glorify it, or
it can't be marketed to youth. There can't be self-service machines, or you can't have a pot vending machine, I guess. Not that anyone was someone was probably thinking about it, but
Oh,
they were
I'm
probably
sure
stoned at the time.
I'm sure someone was thinking about it. And in addition to that, they're instituting tough new penalties surrounding giving or selling marijuana to minors. And like these are tough penalties where it can be up to 14 years in prison, which strikes me as very high for what these is. Like, I haven't actually looked this up, but I'd be surprised if giving alcohol or cigarettes to a minor nets you 14 years.
Well, it's the same thing sort of across the board in here. It's like we're going to legalize it within a certain framework, and if you go outside that framework, shit hits the fan. Like, they're doing a bunch of changes to the Impaired Driving Act, so now being stoned while driving will have a penalty from $1,000 fine as the sort of minimum to life in prison if you injure or kill someone while driving. And it's not clear to me if that's on top of, say, like vehicular manslaughter, this typical crime you'd get charged with, hitting someone with a car and killing them, and then you'd also get the hitting them stoned. But that's significantly higher than drunk driving, and that's just sort of weird. Cannabis advocates will talk about how it's not actually as dangerous to drive while stoned, not that you should do it, but you don't tend to drive as fast while stoned as you do when you're drunk. But I guess they want to have we're still being tough on criminals while legalizing the drug that's been criminalized for almost a century now.
Yeah, it very much seems like they're trying to fend off as many criticisms as possible with this, at least from the right, where they're legalizing it, but it's a tough legalization. We're not going to allow any of the other stuff at all, and we're in fact probably going to harshen a lot of the penalties.
One thing that is at least nice in how they've approached this is they are saying they're not going to criminally prosecute any youth that have up to 5 grams in marijuana. That doesn't mean they can have it, but they want to sort of not just throw kids in jail, so they'll still probably get a fine or just generally get a slap on the wrist. But then there's also this like new crime that they're inventing of using children to traffic weed, which I guess you need to put in there if you've like created a loophole. So now having kids take pot door to door becomes a problem.
Yeah, and that also in fact nets you 14 years, or up to 14 years, which once again seems a little harsh what they're doing. Now granted, this is the maximum sentence, so unlikely we'll ever see that handed down, but it is quite high.
Of course, the other issue with this is a bill. It's going to take a while to go through the House of Commons and then through the Senate, where I'm sure senators on all sides of the aisle are going to have all kinds of critiques.
In fact, they're already making noises about interfering with it a bit.
So they're hoping to have it legalized by July 1st of next year, and whether or not they hit that will be an open question. But what I guess isn't is that people will still be going to jail in the meantime for minor drug crimes.
Yeah, and that seems to be the real thing they've just oddly missed here or just disregarded. And I can understand, like, from a rule of law point of view, you don't want to not enforce a law that's on the books because it undermines kind of trust in the system and everything, but...
Even though BC has been not enforcing the law for quite a while.
Yeah. It's less ideal, for sure, than, just changing the law. But that's kind of the problem, is they never did the decriminalization, which would have been really easy to do early on, or even just like now. They could do something simple, a simple decriminalization while they worked out all the details. But in the meantime, a whole bunch of arrests, whole bunch of convictions have happened after everybody basically was expecting it to be legalized because the Liberals won on a legalization platform.
So overall, it is a bill that will legalize cannabis for personal use, and I don't use much, or I've never bought weed, so I don't actually know if 30 grams is enough, but it seems like enough to have a good weekend.
Yeah, we're probably the two people in BC who haven't actually smoked.
I have smoked, but am not right now.
Yeah, well, I'm the rare British Columbian who never smoked it, but it's one of those things where it seems reasonable, the amount they've set.
But then the sort of criminal side of it and what offenses they're bringing in seem to go higher and harder than necessary. So it's this weird balance of, we're going to let you have it, but here's where the fence is, and this is where you can play, but that's it. That's all you can do. Or you go to jail still.
Yeah, and one of the other big questions that hasn't been answered yet is there's no details on prices or taxation. Is there going to be a minimum price like most places set with alcohol? Are we going to see so many taxes levied on this it's still going to be cheaper to buy on the black market and nobody's going to be going to the official stores anyway?
Yeah, the Liberals did not include cannabis taxes in their election promises and haven't included it in any budget yet. But there have been estimates all over the place that this could raise billions of dollars a year, or there are the more conservative ones but in any situation, it will raise some money. So we'll have to still wait and see what they come out with for the taxation side. All right, for a final bonus segment, we're going to cut in a bit of Ryan Clayton, the BC Greens Communications Coordinator, and our conversation with him that we did with Barry from This Is Lotusland. Look for that coming out in the next couple weeks on their podcast. Take it away, Ryan, and us. Thank you for joining us, Ryan. Maybe you could tell us a bit from the Green perspective what you think this election coming up is going to be about.
I think this election is going to hinge on several questions, one of which is simply trust in government. Do we trust the government? Are they making decisions on our behalf, or are they making shady deals on their own behalf? And I think every party needs to be able to answer that question. I also think this election is really predicated on where do we want to go as a province? Do we want to continue in the way that we have for the last several decades, or do we want to set a new direction?
So on that theme of charting a new path, how did the Greens kind of go from being a single issue, somewhat fringe party to one that's kind of come into the forefront in BC politics and gaining ground as a legitimate third option?
I think some of it was just out of necessity. BC has been largely a two-party province going back many years. There's usually a third-party presence, but they're usually not all that strong. Here and there, little third parties have jumped up, usually in elections where the NDP ends up winning. But overall, they haven't had a huge presence. But in BC, it's been very entrenched that it's been left versus right, corporations versus workers. And what's ended up happening is that everything else gets lost and the discussions don't change. The last three elections in a row have pretty much been on the same theme, same topic, same subject, and really nothing's changed. The seat count comes in at roughly the same, and people are just getting sick of it. Our voter turnout keeps going down every election. People have been desperate for another option. Last election, some people rallied around the Greens, some people rallied around the BC Conservatives. A lot of people rallied around the potential for independents to get elected. And then over the last 4 years, people have really taken the time. They didn't want to sit on the sidelines anymore. They didn't want another election where it's just the same two parties fighting the same old battles. And so they started building, and they worked very hard over the last 4 years to build up the infrastructure for the Green Party to be competitive in as many ridings as possible. Obviously, it's not going to be every riding. We're still a growing party. We're still developing. But we are now in a place where we can actually challenge a number of ridings, and we can really influence the conversation on the provincial level. And we've seen that with a lot of issues where we've raised an issue, particularly Andrew Weaver in the House has raised an issue. And then very shortly after, the other parties start talking about it, start taking positions. For example, MSP, Andrew Weaver raised it in the House. He introduced bills saying that the MSP needs to go. Now every party is talking about it, and it's going to be every party has taken position on it, and every party actually intends now to get rid of it. That's something that really started with Andrew Weaver making a big show of it in the legislature because neither of the parties wanted to talk about it.
Well, I don't think you'll find anyone who will speak badly about the work ethic of Andrew Weaver, but how do you sort of broaden that across the province to make the argument that in every riding, people need to get behind the Greens? Like, how do you sort of stop that strategic voting? Like, if people want to get the Liberals out in a lot of ridings, the NDP is arguably the historically better choice. So how do you sort of defeat that strategic voting argument?
Well, considering that over the last 80 years, the NDP's won a grand total of 3 elections, I'm not sure they are the better choice. They don't have a track record of winning elections, particularly not against right-wing coalitions. So part of it is that, we do need a third option. We have put our faith in the NDP time and time again, and they haven't come through for us. Now, I'm not involved in politics because I hate the BC Liberals. I actually have a great relationship with a number of them. I fundamentally disagree with the direction they're taking this province, but I do get along with a lot of them, and I actually feel I can work with them. Certainly, one-to-one, I have great friendships with a number of BC Liberals. So I'm not here because I hate them. I'm not here because I want, desperately need them out of office. I'm here because we truly need a third option. I think that's what's going to appeal to people. We're presenting, in the past, we've presented ideas to the table. This time we're presenting a fully costed platform. In the past, we've presented candidates that were willing to stand. This time we've identified a number of really star candidates who are stepping forward, who, regardless of what party they would run for, they are a star candidate. They would make an excellent MLA. And I think at the very end of the day, what we also want to make sure is that if people do decide that they are absolutely sick of the Liberals and the NDP, and they decide to rally around a third option, which has happened several places, not just in Canada, but around the world, we want to be ready for it. And that's what we've been preparing for. That's why we presented our platform in the way that it is. We want to be ready that if that does happen here, we're ready to work on day one. I can go more in depth into that if you like.
I was just thinking maybe you could, I know the parties all haven't put out their platforms yet, but sort of what is the outline beyond just, obviously the Greens have the strong environmental platform, but how is it more than a single issue party? Sort of fill us in a bit on what's the primary focus of the Greens this year? What's the positive vision you're bringing?
Yeah, well, I think a lot of it is based on the work of Andrew Weaver in the House. As you guys probably know, because you guys follow politics quite closely, he's introduced a number of ideas on a wide array of issues, largely just working on behalf of the people of Oak Bay Gordon Head. It's not like he went in, he actually was very clear when he went in. He didn't intend to be the leader of the party. He did not want to be, the future premier. What he wanted to do was represent the people of Oak Bay Gordon Head, and he took every concern that came to his office and he brought it into the legislature in the best way that he could. That's identified a lot of issues that weren't being identified by the other parties. They weren't being championed by the NDP. They weren't being picked up by the BC Liberals. And suddenly we ended up with so many different ideas, so many approaches, that we were able to build a coalition around those issues. Some of the things that we have identified, the biggest one is probably ban big money. We've really focused on the fact that we need to get big money out of our politics. We need to rein in the Wild West of British Columbia politics by taking away the ability for corporations to directly influence our political parties through millions and millions of dollars in donations. Right now, the BC Liberals, I think it was estimated they have about $16 million for this election. That's an insane amount of money. You don't need that much money to run an election anywhere. In fact, you really don't need all that much money if you're going to go knock on doors and talk to people. So we took a stance in September. We announced that we would no longer be accepting any corporate or union donations, which made up about 15% of our revenue for a year. And that's been very successful. We've seen a huge amount of increase in individual donations to our party. We've seen our fundraising go up quite a bit. It's the reason why I'm able to work for the party full time as opposed to sit on the sidelines and volunteer here and there. That issue suddenly became a huge topic of conversation. And I think part of it, I'd love to say that the Greens can take credit for that. I think actually credit probably stands with Gary Mason and Kathleen Tomlinson at the Globe and Mail. They've really been on this for well over a year. They've been on it with teeth. They've been fighting for this. And now, the NDP ended up under a lot of fire for the fact that they have said that they're going to ban corporate and union donations, but they continue to accept them now. And they insist that won't affect their decisions over the next 4 years, which is also what Clark insists. And then, of course, the BC Liberals, absolutely, they have no intention of reining it in, putting in caps on donations. Everything's going to stay the same if they're reelected.
Okay, well, that's one of those issues that's kind of more of a process, kind of how politics works. What about kind of what the Green Party's looking to do more for the people of British Columbia?
How will you solve the housing crisis? To narrow it down.
Housing is going to be a platform we're going to be coming out with later, and I'm rather excited about it. A couple things that we have put forward that I can talk about. One is that we've proposed to do a pilot project of basic income, look at whether that's going to be the best approach for British Columbia, whether that would work for our communities here as a replacement to our current social safety net, which is fairly patchwork. Applying for EI or applying for disability is a long process. The monitoring on it is quite harsh and punitive. We're looking at whether or not we could just do a basic income, cover the fundamentals, and make sure that everyone has the basic safety net. So that's and that probably speaks quite a bit to our values. We're taking the approach of everyone should be supported. Government's role is to ensure the well-being of British Columbians first and foremost, beyond anything else. Some of the other things we've looked at is, say, a housing first policy, making sure that when we're talking about housing and homelessness, that people do have access to a shelter and accommodation. We have been talking about affordable, accessible, and quality childcare, and how we would look at making sure that there are childcare spaces being opened up so that people aren't unable to find a space, which is currently the problem, or one of the many problems around childcare. We've been looking at a living wage, making sure that every British Columbian is able to make the amount of money that they need to survive at a fundamental level. I suppose when I think about all the things that we're putting forward, we're very focused on people. We're focused on the fact that over the last 16 years, I'd even argue even further than that, the interests of companies, the interests of big labor, the interests of sort of the whole has been looked at. The interests of individuals who are, they're working two low-paying part-time jobs to try to survive, that hasn't been looked at because that person is looked at as someone with a job. So therefore, they're employed and they're fine. According to Clark's jobs plan, we're working. And so we're really focused on what we're hearing from people is that their needs aren't being met. And the gap between the sort of establishment and the elite is getting further and further away from the people who are living in, and I'm going to use Salmon Arm as an example where I grew up, where, they've seen multiple companies close down in the community. They've seen a decrease in lumber prices, and suddenly the community is struggling quite a bit. And so that's really what we're looking at. We're looking at the people who aren't being heard by the current government. We're looking at the people who have needs that aren't being met, and their well-being isn't being ensured by the government. And that's really the approach that we take to every platform piece that we're releasing.
Moving on, Metro Vancouver's done their latest homelessness survey, and what's probably surprising Gregor Robertson in light of his campaign promises, there are in fact still homeless in Vancouver, and in fact the numbers have gone up. Identified a total of 3,605, and that's a 30% jump from 2014.
This is part of the every 3-year homeless count that a number of volunteers go out and do, and this is actually a really important sort of statistic to help figure out how many people are homeless, but they also talk to these people and figure out sort of what issues are facing them. And so there's lots of good data in this. It's just unfortunate to see that the numbers are still rising. Gregor's, of course, pointing the blame at Christy Clark as
he does for everything,
and as she vice versa does to him.
But it does kind of go to the problems that the housing situation has led to, where you're seeing more homelessness in part because there's just a lack of housing available. And, it's too bad that Greta Robertson and Christy Clark are too busy trading jabs at each other to actually tackle the problem.
In other news, next door, Rachel Notley has sort of poked her nose into the BC election. She's announced that, quote, "It's difficult for one to be working for our government, the Alberta NDP, and also supporting candidates who would be opposed to the successful construction of the Kinder Morgan pipeline. We see that as being critical to our economic prosperity and growth in this province. That is the message that has been delivered, and I trust that the people will follow it." So she's basically telling to Alberta NDP supporters, MLAs, and members, don't support the BC NDP right now. And where some parties, most parties actually, are independent across the country, the NDP is still all branches of one party. And there's a long tradition of activists going from one province to another or to the federal scene and strategists and helping each other. And here's the one NDP premier saying, yeah, we're not supporting our neighbour get elected. That's not saying she's endorsing the BC Liberals or the BC Greens, because the BC Greens really don't want pipelines. But it's the sort of active disassociating yourself that you don't tend to see in the NDP.
Yeah, but on the other hand, you can't really blame her because, when both the federal and the provincial NDP here are very anti-major infrastructure that will benefit Alberta's primary industry, it's pretty hard to politically support that.
Well, there's not politically supporting it, and then there's actively sort of, stabbing your party brother in the back or in the front.
Is it stabbing them in the back so much to say, hey, it doesn't send the right message if people working for our government are doing stuff that's directly in conflict with the interests of our government?
I think what it more is right now, from her perspective, is a sort of pitch to the soft, progressive conservative vote who are looking at Jason Kenney and the Wildrose and going, we don't want any of that. The Alberta NDP has basically become the sort of moderate, centrist, center-left catch-all umbrella. And I think she's trying to pitch for that broader tent to go into the next election. Because it doesn't actually matter if she publicly supports John Horgan or not, because no one in BC is changing their vote depending on what Alberta says.
Yeah, but a lot of people might change their vote if, if Alberta gets a month of stories about Alberta government staff or Alberta NDP party staff are working against pipelines. That's the sort of, you're right about having a broad tent because it's Alberta. The tent of people who are anti-pipeline, it's a pretty small tent. You might pick up downtown Edmonton and lose the entire province other than that.
But nevertheless, there are NDP supporters from Alberta in BC, just as there were NDP supporters from BC in Alberta during that election. They're just, I guess, keeping their heads a little low this time.
In Conservative leadership news, Brad Frost continues his proud tradition of being the biggest stick in the mud in the House of Commons and in federal politics in general, more or less, by wanting to drug test MPs. Apparently, he thinks that MPs have been legislating under the influence and that should really be stopped.
You can't show up to your job higher drunk. Why should members of Parliament? Brad's been in the House of Commons long enough that he has seen members from all sides appear in the House of Commons, vote and debate while he believes them to be intoxicated. This isn't okay. And with the legalization of marijuana, he believes this trend is only going to accelerate. That's why he's calling for the mandatory drug and alcohol testing of members of Parliament.
It's just one of those things that just seems so ridiculous that it's even getting proposed.
I just love the claim that he thinks he knows who's been drunk, and now I want the names. Like, undoubtedly someone's come back from the pub at lunch, a few beers in, and maybe the boys in short pants can give us some insight into that, but I'm sure they don't want to name names because they still want to have jobs in the future. But yeah, this is not going to happen.
If someone was, obviously drunk in the House of Commons, it's the sort of thing the Parliamentary Press Gallery would have noted up till now. So I think the more likely thing is that, Brad Frost is seeing drunkards where none exist.
And finally, in foreign policy news, Justin Trudeau has come out with some stronger words suggesting that Assad should be removed as leader of Syria. He was making the comments during his trip to France to mark the Battle of Vimy Ridge, and he talked about Russia needs to be made aware of its responsibility in the bloody actions by the Assad regime. So he's also talking about stronger sanctions and other means against Russia. And overall, it's just sort of a hardening of tone for Justin Trudeau, who's sort of avoided almost the foreign policy talk in favor of, I guess, domestic issues as he's been Prime Minister.
Yeah, this is definitely the strongest stance Trudeau has had on the Syria conflict and Assad. And, until now, he's more or less not wanted to get involved in it at all. And even after the chemical attack, but before Trump launched the missile strike, it was kind of a fairly, We need to investigate, see what's going on here. And now this is a hard line. Assad needs to go, and that definitely represents a change of tone on the Prime Minister's part. And it's kind of a little more forceful. It's the sort of thing you'd more expect from a Stephen Harper than Justin Trudeau.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how this plays in Canada. We're not a country that I think is generally very pro-militaristic intervention. There were infamously large protests against the idea that Canada would go into Iraq following 9/11. And with the complicated mess that is the sort of Syrian civil war, just saying we're going to go in and take out Assad leaves you with a big question of like, what is his long-term plan here? Or is he suggesting Canada gets involved in Syria for the next 2 decades, like rebuilding a country?
Well, that's the thing, is he didn't actually lay out kind of what it would entail beyond, a little more sanctions or whatnot, and that the end state can't have Assad in power, but how we get there remains quite a bit of a mystery, and Syria is sadly one of those things that there doesn't seem to be an easy or even a difficult solution to. So yeah, we're going to have to see on that. But right now, without any sign of what's going to be backing up the rhetoric, it's a little hard to see where things are going to go from here. And that has been Politicos. Find links to the stories we mentioned in the show notes at politicos.ca. Make sure to subscribe on iTunes, wherever you listen to podcasts, and follow us on Facebook and Twitter at PoliticosPod. Leave us a review and let us know what you think. And if you have any ideas for the show, feel free to send it to us. Thanks for listening.